Would you like to make an interview now?
If there's not, no. Okay. But yeah, José, yes. D'accord.
Je crois que nous allons essayer de reprendre les places. Si tout le monde peut regagner sa place pour cette deuxième partie du débat. Donc, nous remercions M. Tassos Agnotis de la Commission européenne de nous avoir rejoints, ainsi que, je pense, c'est José Ferreira, João Ferreira de la LOE. Nous avons également donc, Antonio Onorati de l'organisation Cocheria, ainsi qu'Andrea Ferrante de la coordination européenne Via Campesina, pour cette deuxième table ronde qui va poser la question qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire au niveau institutionnel
institutions for the whole of Europe to be able to counter this general land grabbing movement. And it isn't only the land grabbing, land use is something which is a big problem across Europe and elsewhere, because holdings are becoming bigger and bigger, so fewer and fewer farmers are effectively employed in agriculture. And we have also to see what type of production we want to have, how we're going to use the land for agriculture. And we, farmers, peasant farmers, there are all these movements which we need to tie together Europe-wide so that we can make people more aware of land problems. And because we are trying to ensure food security, that's something everybody is bothered about, but also for us, the matter of food sovereignty, which is important. So access to the land, to seeds, to resources, the food chain, what we're eating, who is effectively responsible for taking these big decisions. So I don't want to try to recap on everything that is still ahead of us. We've got a fairly large number of copies of the book about land grabbing, which sums up quite nicely what it's all about. So I think we can plunge straight in. What can be done? What should be done? What can the Rome institutions, the EU institutions do about this? So if you could introduce yourselves first.
D'accord. Merci. Oui, merci, bonjour à tout le monde.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Antonio Onorati. I'm the president of the Italian collective called Crocevia, which is the oldest set up in Italy of this type and in the agro-food sector. And I'm certainly in favor of land reform. My family has actually farmed for something like 1,000 years. And with the fascists, we found ourselves fighting for reform for many years, 150 years, and then as of 58 things did change, but it wasn't perhaps what we expected. But my angle or backdrop here, looking at this international instrument, is despite the fact that the law wasn't what we'd expected, wasn't properly respected, but it was quite good because my family got their land and about 1 million people got title to land. and a large number of holdings were set up in places where there had been none previously. In 1948, farms of more than 5 hectares was something like 0.2% of the total, and they had something between 20 and 25% of the total amount of land. And then the EU came into being, and there was the CAP. In 2010, farms bigger than 500 hectares now are in control of 30% of the available land area for farming, or even really edging onto 50% in some other countries. So how did this idea come up? The idea of having an international instrument for land governance. It was because there wasn't only the UN where these things could have been discussed. There's the EU, but they didn't want to discuss the issue of land because the problems are so gigantic, and the right to produce, the right to food security, are really major issues. And of course, being able to have enough to eat is a basic right. Often armed conflicts result from the fact that there have been clashes over land use. So the land isn't just for planting carrots, it's also got water, minerals, and all sorts of other goodies that it can offer up. So we don't want to have recourse to arms. But what also happened as part of this social movement was that we came to see that governments weren't able to deal with these issues on their own. This led to a struggle over several years, and we finally said we'd be prepared to back what they were doing, providing that certain underlying principles were respected. I would hope that the EP would do the same. First of all, social autonomy at the base, and the agricultural producers should have their organizations and federations that will be recognized and included as representatives in the discussions and negotiations. And these principles were accepted, which was why we then were prepared to play a part in the negotiations. We are also allowed to launch initiatives and make proposals, but we were not going to be able to stand in for the government. So it was going to be not the market or the public, but the government that took decisions regarding the use of land. And we've got this book. You can see in examples of other countries, in Romania, in Sardinia. The basic rules remain the same. So whether it's China, Romania, Scotland, Italy, you've got corrupt people who are upholding certain policies, a form of governance which is not acceptable. And so together with governments, having an international negotiation ongoing provides at least a frame, a reference frame, whereby we can establish what we know as soft law, which is a legal base on which we can build. It means that your approach then changes completely. because it has to be a given that markets cannot resolve questions relating to land and land use. And the fundamental here is that access to the land, use, sustainable use of the land and the attached rights are all inextricably linked to basic human rights. The basic human rights that all member states should respect. Any violation of these rights for access to land is therefore a violation of human rights. So that's a major step forward. So it's not the law of the market, but it's basic human rights that we can call into play. What are the main salient points? So we got this legal framework, and the question then was who exactly would be involved and participate in the negotiations. Of course, having to have a cordial relationship with member states. Member states represented by governments who sometimes would be more on the side of peasant farmers, sometimes more on the side of agro-business. But we could have a discussion to see what we were going to do and how we could ensure food security and food sovereignty. So these were basics, fundamentals in the text, which for some 30 years that this was all under discussion, is now a complete revision of attitudes and the approach of all sides really to the question. The second element is governance. Governance for access to the land or land management. These are responsibilities for the state and the public authorities. It could not be otherwise. So you have to assume that they're prepared to shoulder the responsibility for proper governance. Thirdly, responsibilities or liabilities. There are some for the state, but also for non-state entities. And this is important. For the first time, we can read that non-state entities, so those who are investing, for example, those who are doing the things which make land grabbing worthwhile, as a result of which there will be land grabbing. But making access easy, for whom exactly? This is the next point, because you have to have access to the land guaranteed for those who have no land or who don't have enough to be able to produce something. In excess of 70% of European farms are less than 5 hectares. So to introduce measures for them to be able to go from 5 to 30, of course, is a very long list. So you've got these various responsibilities that different parties have, and you have to see
we are presenting today here is just to remember to ourselves that Europe is extremely affected by land grabbing, as Africa, as Asia, as Latin America. We are exactly in the same situation, and we need answer, immediate answer. And we need to fight, as Willy said this morning, we need to fight, as Isabella said this morning, and we need to do that every day. And at the same time, it is clear and evident for all of us that we have a giant problem in our Europe, that for us it's impossible to access to land. Youth are not in the condition to access to land. All people that are coming out from the crisis and want to start again farming, it's impossible to start to farm. Be a farmer, it's more difficult to be a lawyer in this Europe. This is something that it's not credible, and we need to give answer now. And the common agriculture policy, as it is quite evident, will not give any answer in that sense. But this is a responsibility for all of us to give answer to this problem. And we ask at all levels, from our local fights, the local level, as we have saw in Andalusia, at national level, at regional level, and at European level, that we start to give answer now. And this means that in practical, we have international instruments, as Antonio told us. We have tenure guidelines, clear and evident, that can inspire our legislation. It can inspire our legislation to defend our rights, our basic fundamental rights. And this is what is important. We have to go back to our rights in all our policy. If Europe wants to guarantee food security, it has to go back on respecting our fundamental rights. Are not the trade law that will guarantee food security tomorrow. And for that, if we want to go back to our basic and fundamental rights, we need to use the international instrument that we have and that we have voted. Because in May 2012, all the governments of Europe, the European Union, has voted these tenure guidelines, and we need to implement. So we ask very strongly that the Parliament, with its fundamental role as the heart of democracy and participation of the European institution, immediately before the end of this legislation, come out with a clear resolution on that. We need a clear resolution that we need to implement the tenure guidelines in Europe. And this clear resolution has to be the starting point for a work that the other institutions of the European Union, and for sure, first of all, the Commission and the Council, start to work on this problem. And we need to work on that. And we ask DG Agri to be the actor in that sense, because it's a fundamental right for the farmers. We want that the farmers, the smallholders that we represent, has the opportunity to defend and protect their rights. And this is your institutional mandate. And we need to go back on that. And we need to do something now in a short time. Because we don't have a lot of time in that sense. Because things are happening so fast. And we need to control that. So we need also an official European observatory on land grabbing happening in Europe. And we need that the Parliament start to make research on that. We need answer on the official answer. Because it's important that we denounce that. It's important that the civil society comes here and clearly state that. But we need official answer from the institutions. Land grabbing is there. Our rights are not anymore there. And we want that the official institution starts to say that. And we need answer in that sense. So for us, the European Observatory on land grabbing is an essential instrument and tools that can help us to strengthen our fight that anyhow we will do in every country to protect and defend every square meters of our land. Because we are doing that, and we will never stop to do that. But we need instrument in that sense. So the observatory, the resolution, that is very important. We are in the Parliament not by chance. We want that the European Parliament be a fundamental actor to help us to put in practice fundamental legislation to protect and ensure our basic rights. And the Parliament has a role and can play this role with this resolution before the end of this legislation. And for sure, for us, it means that we need to go also beyond the idea that agriculture is only the common agriculture policy. It is a lot more. Or at least it's a lot more of what we think to the common agriculture policy. And in that sense, we want to challenge DG Agri to start to think in that sense. And this is important because we really need today a policy for the smallholders that are the ones that are guaranteeing today food security in Europe, that are guaranteeing the food for the European citizens. And we need to guarantee their fundamental rights to continue to boost a model of production, a model of distribution, a model of consumption that is really at the base of what we think is food sovereignty and what we think are the fundamental rights of the citizens of the European citizens. So if we go back to our idea that what is important is our fundamental rights, we think that we can have a real opportunity also to have much more job in agriculture, much more farmers. We need more farmers and we need policy to have more farmers. And to have more farmers, it's an answer today to the crisis. And this is our basic fundamental rights, because when we heard this morning that in 11,000 hectares in Romania, there are 99 employees, that is something that we can never accept. This is not a model of production. This is not a model of production. These are people that are killing the agriculture in Europe. They are killing our society, our welfare system. And so in that sense, we can never accept that this model will be the model of the future. So in that sense, we need to give answer and we need to play everybody's role. Civil society will do its role, because it is clear that in this room there are different networks, and we are working together to join those different networks that are working on land, and this is our commitment. We will be there. We will be there joining all our strength, and we will be there to control all this process, because we want that this process go ahead, really. It's not a seminar today. It's the start of a policy, it's the start of a fight, clear fight for us to protect and defend our rights. So in that sense, this is our responsibility, and now I'm talking to our friends of the civil society organization, the other farmers movement, the other NGO, who is working on that. It's our role to make a strong and clear network in that sense, and working together, because the European institution, the local institution, the local authority, the national authority has to give us some answer. And we have to challenge them. And we can challenge them if we strengthen our effort. Because we can't leave our Romanian comrades alone in their fights. We can't leave Willy alone, and we need to work together in that sense. So this is our responsibility. But if this is our responsibility, it's clear that we will challenge you, we will challenge the Parliament, we will challenge the Council, and we will challenge the Commission to have clear answer in short time. Thank you.
Donc, je laisse la parole à Tassos Aniotis. I'm going to give the floor to Tassos Aniotis from DG Agriculture, the Economic Directorate. and he can give us some initial reaction from the Commission side. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I will be straight and honest to you from the beginning, because you don't, I think, expect from a representative of the Commission today to give answers to all these questions you have raised, especially on an issue which is extremely complex. I believe it is an issue that is pertinent. Personally, I have been focusing on land issues. In fact, maybe I'm glad that I took the term land markets out after what you said about markets and only put about land in my presentation in the title. I've been focusing about land issues for quite some time. In fact, you will see a reference later on the first time that this was referred in the Parliament in Comagri, when then Commissioner Fischler, whose member of the cabinet I was, made the presentation of the CAP reform proposal, and the focus of the need for a neutrality in the policy reform on land prices was there. I raise this issue because there have been two studies done. One of them was recently presented in the European Parliament on land markets and factor markets in the European Union that were initiated by DG Agri. And this is an issue that was at the core of our discussions, not only in the impact assessments we did for the current reform, but also on the impact assessment for the health check. That's the first time we presented the issue. And it's driven also by the experience that took place in the United States in the early 80s, when there was a collapse in land prices and a huge indebtedness of the U.S. farm sector, for which I was a graduate student at the U.S. at the time. I learned some lessons personally. So I believe this is a very pertinent issue. I also believe that the other issues that you have raised are pertinent in the policy debate today. One is all the issues of distribution, whether it is in agriculture or outside agriculture, whether it is within or among member states throughout the globe. And also some of the legal issues that are raised. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist by training, but I would have some questions on the manner by which you presented these issues, because the EU, the Union is based on a fundamental right of a freedom of movement of the factors that can move, which is capital and labor, and which have also obviously an impact on the factor that cannot move, which is land. So how we deal with this type of issues legally, and they're linked to property rights, which you also alluded that are there and present, is not straightforward. As an introductory element, before I go to what I had to say today, I would also consider that you would need to make a clear distinction when you use the word grabbing among three different elements that are very important to distinguish. What is the difference between investment on land that is coming outside of agriculture? Is investment on land that is coming from within agriculture, from some farmers that purchase land of other farmers? And what happens when we have a violation of law with respect to the case where the law is not violated? Because the manner by which the term has been used, land grabbing, which applies to all sorts of possible situations, does not allow for concrete policy proposals and solutions. You have invited us to come up with clear proposals, but we have to define first what is the problem that we have to solve. And in my personal view, that's a Commission opinion, my personal view, the use of land grabbing to all sorts of situations doesn't help necessarily that. Now, going to what I had to say, I will briefly focus on three things. First of all, on some of the main drivers of land markets, on some facts about EU land markets.
We will move because we want to see.
Please move.
We leave you alone.
I take this as a compliment, don't worry. So, the main drivers of land markets, some facts on the EU land markets based on what we have seen. I will be very brief. There is much more background available even on our website. And some CAP policy responses of today. First of all, it all starts with this graph. And it all starts with this graph because this is how the debate on land grabbing started. And what this graph shows is three things in parallel. This is the evolution of commodity price trends from after the Second World War up until recently. You have with green agricultural prices, with red energy prices, with blue is metals and minerals, which reflect the very strong growth of China in India in recent years, and also with purple you have the evolution of fertilizer prices. And you see in this graph three things in parallel. First, that the price level is much higher in all commodity markets today than what we have historically seen for quite some time. And there is, in fact, an inversal of the downward trend of agricultural prices. This is in real terms. Second, you have greater price volatility than what we have had in the past. And third, you also have co-movement of prices. And in all this situation, if you look at what is happening on the top, agriculture is the losing sector. It is squeezed by the fact that other sectors which increase the cost of agricultural production have moved further in terms of prices. But at the same time, the prices of agricultural commodities, crops in nominal terms in the bottom, have also increased dramatically and are expected to stay up there. And this is an important element for those of you that, and I think probably are most in this room, criticize all the discussion about the WTO, because the WTO discussion is totally irrelevant to what is happening right now in terms of the actual price level. And I would like to introduce two other factors that affect price developments. First one is what is happening in energy. And I'm not using energy globally, because if you look at the relationship between oil and coal prices, one moves with the other. But I will focus only on natural gas, because we have had in the last couple of years three different markets. We've had the market in Europe that basically follows oil prices and Russia prices with some delay. We have the market in Asia that has been affected by the impact of the nuclear accident in Japan. And we have the market in the US that has been affected by fracking and these new techniques of natural gas extraction. Whatever debate we make about the pros and the cons of different techniques, why is this graph important? It is important because it changes completely the macroeconomic environment within which all the world economy is going to develop. The United States will soon become a major energy exporter. This is a monumental change in the balance of power, of economic power among players. It has an impact in agriculture because there are roughly 50 fertilizer plants that are being built right now in the United States because of this cost advantage, and it will have an impact in the cost of production in the European Union. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to it in terms of the CAP policy response. And the third impact that will affect prices, I will come later on how differently it affects, is what is happening today. Because today in Luxembourg, the discussion is about the distribution of support among member states along this model, and within member states with the model that will be defined in the context of the negotiations today, but more or less will have an impact on the level of support, on the distributions of support among farmers. And as a result, it will have a certain impact on land prices that is going to be very different from one farmer to the other. Now, some main facts. The first one, that's the part that was in Fischler's speech, is that you have three elements that affect land prices. One is called urban sprawl, urbanization, what have you. It's the pressure that we're having from urban centers on agricultural land. Sometimes it takes out some of the best land, and this is not a European phenomenon. It's a phenomenon elsewhere, except maybe for Australia, where there is mining that is taking out some of the best agricultural land right now. We don't have, with the common agricultural policy, any control of what is happening there. Other type of policies, regional policy, environmental policy, could have an impact. Commodity market developments do have an impact on land prices. Land prices tend to reflect what is happening in commodity prices and expectations about where things are going to go. And this is why it is important to keep in mind, first of all, that what is driven by market fundamentals, because markets are not to be thrown in the wastebasket on everything, what is really reflecting changes in supply and demand factors in markets and the messages that they pass to farmers, it's a useful message that farmers could use to make adjustments in the production. What comes as a very distorting signal from markets could, on the other hand, distort completely farm decisions. And here, in the debate we have had in recent years, we have seen two false alarms. The first false alarm was in 2008, where everybody tended to attribute, or almost everybody, the increase in commodity prices and agricultural prices to strong demand for wheat and rice in China and India. We know there was no such thing, so it was other type of factors that were driving the debate. Last year, there was also attribution to what happened in agricultural prices to biofuels. And this took place at the time that the biofuel growth had stagnated in the United States for 3 years in a row. So there are other factors that do distort the signals that farmers get from time to time, including bottlenecks in the food chain, that are pretty important and do have an impact on land prices. And yes, the cap should have an influence on these developments, and I will mention a little bit later what we try to do. And finally, there is an area where we have a very direct influence, and which is a level of support. Whether this level of support is the old style of very high support prices that actually shifted and increased the price of all factors of production, from the fertilizer use to capital and machinery to land, to the more direct link of these support prices to land, which obviously has a more direct link on prices. So keep this in mind, because the impact from the policy is not uniform and straightforward. Now, EU land markets differed widely across member states, both in legal terms and in economic terms. And all the studies that were done outside point to that. First of all, land policy is an exclusive member state competence. And when you ask us to do something about that, this is something that you need to take into account. It's member states that determine what is going to happen, and they determine what is going to happen naturally because their history is so different. And this is an element that has to be taken into account. Whatever judgment we make about the land market situation and the legal situation in different member states, this is a reflection of their history, and it is through the better integration into the European Union, and to the extent that we want to better integrate ourselves, that this could be gradually resolved. Second, we have also seen that land tenure differs enormously between member states. On the average, 50% of land is rented in the European Union, but this average rate ranges from 20 to 80%. And even in member states where the percentages of land rented is similar, the difference in the model of support they have and in the legal situation they have does have an impact on land prices and what is actually happening in these member states. And finally, what we have seen is the same cap tools have had a very different impact in different member states, which indicates that the loss has to do with the implementation of the cap within member states. So there is I will send you the corrected version of the PowerPoint because 3 lines disappeared. These are the lines where I wanted to say what is the logic of the current cap reform, or at least of the proposal, because we will see what will happen and what will come out today. We're talking about a public policy, and a public policy needs to have a justification. And what justifies public intervention? First of all, you have to intervene where markets fail. Markets clearly fail on the environment. This is why there is a strong accent on environmental issues in the cap reform. Markets have failed in terms of the transparency and the reflection of the real fundamentals in the financial markets in recent years. And there are several initiatives to try to mitigate this impact. Second, you have also to look where policy fails or needs adjustment. And obviously, even the best reform of a certain period of time needs adjustment where the world and around us changes. And what we have identified as an area where the policy needs major change, 2 areas actually. One is on a more greening, more focus on environmental delivery. And the second area is the issue of redistribution of support, because support reflects what was happening in the past, and we want it to reflect what should happen in the future. So what is the essence of the proposal? The essence of the proposal is that there is a tension that needs to be resolved, a contradiction. from an economic point of view, the interest of the farmer is to squeeze costs as much as possible to be economically viable. From an environmental point of view, this has to happen by taking into account what is not internalized by prices and markets, which is the environmental cost of what is happening. So this concept of a joint delivery of private and public goods from the land that farmers cultivate is the core of the proposal we made.
We try to have a discussion, so if you can stick to maybe another...
That's my last slide.
Oh, fine.
This is my last slide. So the CAP reform is actually shifting its paradigm by focusing more on land. How? The reference for the retargeting of support on the farmer beneficiary is land, is not a historical level of support, is land itself. Greening focuses as a condition for the granting of support on land use, and the whole complex of more research, more innovation, and more and mandatory advisory focuses on land use changes. You will ask me, obviously, yes, this is what you proposed. Is this what will come out? I don't know, and I presume that not all of it is going to be in. But significant elements in that direction are going to be in, and that's important to keep in mind because we've never done reform overnight. It's a whole process. The distribution of support among and within member states is the one that will have the biggest impact on land use, and therefore will have the biggest impact on land prices. That's why it is essential for us that this redistribution takes place gradually and not overnight, to be as neutral as possible and not create distortions with other sectors. You can imagine what happens if overnight you double the payment that farmers receive while the wage rate stays the same in certain parts. I mean, it would obviously create huge distortions. The internal convergence, our feeling is that the closer it stays to agronomic and economic criteria, the more neutral it's going to be on its impact on land. And finally, it's clear that different member states are going to face completely different challenges. The new member states have had a greater impact of support on land prices because they started with a very low or no level of support, and support was introduced. The member states that moved in the regional model had some capitalization of support to land prices. Those that stayed with the so-called historical model stayed more neutral. These are the ones now that would have to do the adjustment. And the last point, are there specific provisions to facilitate this type of adjustments? There are provisions that aim explicitly to favor and facilitate young farmers as they move into the CAP and into farming. There are provisions that aim to facilitate a clear definition of what is an active farmer and what is a land user, although these, to a large extent, will be constrained by what happens with national legislation and not by the EU legislation. And finally, the implementation of the greening provisions is going to have a major impact on the manner by which this will impact land prices, and especially on the type of issues that you're discussing. And a final point, a lot of the issues that you raise draw a distinction between small and big, as long as these are farmers. One has to see also the possibilities that are there and often not used in producer organizations and grouping of producers, collective action to address some of these issues. Because at the end of the day, we have to answer also to another question. I heard we need more farmers. But most of the growth in productivity in the farming sector in Europe has taken place exactly because we had less farmers and not most farmers. I'm not suggesting kick people out of agriculture. I saw your comment. What I'm raising is a very clear issue. There is a long-term trend. Is the issue really how many farmers in farming you're going to have in rural areas? Or is the issue what type of relationship you would have farmers with people staying in rural areas? And I'll give you an example from my country. In Greece, there is a monstrous unemployment rate among young people. And there are bottlenecks all over the place in the farming sector. And there are positive messages from the increase in agricultural exports. Where do you get the capacity to better integrate younger people in agriculture? Do you use it by using marketing, by using promotion of products, by using some of the enormous skills that exist in advertising, in design, that exist with unemployed people in the cities, to allow farming to better add value, to promote a different type of logic, or do you do it by bringing people back in agriculture with an average farm size that is not economically feasible, that you're going to squeeze it? So I leave that with a personal challenge, if you want, that I see with the nodding of your heads that don't believe. Why? Because sooner or later, the farming sector in Europe would have to come to grips with a very clear situation. Costs are not going to go down. The costs of production are not going to go down. And if the costs of production are not going to go down, there needs to be adjustment somewhere. An adjustment could happen in capital, could happen in labor, could happen in land. But it has to happen somewhere. Thank you.
Merci de nous avoir donné une vue assez claire du.
Thank you very much. You've given us a pretty clear overview of the Commission's position as it currently is. I expect quite a lot of people will want to put questions so that we can have a debate. I suggest we move straight on to that. Let's keep your comments quite brief and your questions brief so that we've got enough time for a number of questions. We can have 20-25 minutes now of question and answer. But the problems have, I think, been put before us. And we all realize that we're going to have to keep working at this and discussing and negotiating. Over to you.
Willy. Willy?
The minister said, as long as they are farmers. It's not farmers, it's just land grabbers and business people who do farming with huge machines, and they are killing thousands and millions of small-scale peasants. And you, the Western Europe, will receive and already have millions of Eastern Romanian and Bulgarian citizens coming to you. Is that what you want through your productivistic proposal? We are not looking for productivism here. Who said we are looking for productivism? We want livelihoods. We want a Europe worth to live in, not to go where you want to send us. If you give the land to huge companies, where should we go from the place we live now? Where should Romanian gypsies and Romanians and Bulgarians and all the people go? Go begging on your streets? What kind of productivism do you want? This is a sad intervention, and I'm very sad because of this, what you said.
My name is Andreas Bisans. I'm representing the organic biodynamic movement Demeter International here at the EU institutions. Mr. Hanyotis, I understand your concern in your country to have a higher productivity, but I would like to draw your attention. I recently heard a presentation from this NGO called AGTER and Michel Merlet, where they had done a study where they analyzed the added value of farms and enterprises. And the added value included social factors and environmental factors. And you spoke before also about internalizing costs that are in agriculture. And they came to this result when they looked at these added values, that it was the small-scale farms that were 10 times superior most times than the large-scale farms. I would like to draw your attention to this study. Thank you.
My name is Anna Korzensky and I'm working for the Nyeleni Europe movement. Just continuing the previous comment, I would like to also raise the awareness on the question how important to bring young people into agriculture. They play a really important role, not just producing food for the future citizens, but they also have to take care of old farmers. We are all aware the European society is aging. Farmers are aging as well. What will happen with them? Where should they live if they cannot stay at their farm? They develop the great value, and what shall they do if they have to leave their farm? Young people taking over these farms, taking over the activity of old farmers, can ensure that they can die there, and can ensure that the rural area is full with life, and also the social effect of handing and taking over the farms are really important to take into account, and not just the productivity of these small-scale farmers.
Sí, bueno, yo.
Yes, I'd like to just call your attention to three aspects commented upon by the last speaker.
Por una parte.
I think what we need to do is define what we mean by farmers. And farmers are people who produce food. And furthermore, they are people living in the countryside producing food on a sustainable basis. And we should also be aware that country people, farmers, can produce energy. You have to regard them as producers of energy as well. And that is a shortcoming in many policy areas. It's not taken account of. Farmers produce energy, or can do. And if we use languages such as frenetic urban growth, leading to a reduction in the number of people living in the countryside and the number of farmers, we have to be careful. If we say, frenetic urban development leads to farmers leaving the land and going to live in urban areas, I think that, for us, is a negative way of putting things. I think we have to talk more in terms of rural development rather than talking about frenetic urban development. And there's another point I'm not quite sure about that I've heard about this morning. If we're talking about reducing production costs, how do we reconcile that with the interests of the environment? I think basically we should thinking solely in terms of the interests of the environment and making everything else fit in. And in that way, if we're all aiming at saving the environment, farmers can work within that framework, seeking to increase production and increase their income and increase their autonomy. I think we should think about these things that way round.
Hello, my name is Jamie Maloney. I'm here representing the Campaign Against Climate Change as the International Coordinator. I just want to make a point against the last speaker and his advocation of large-scale farming, and throw in the added ingredient of the fact that large-scale farming...
Excuse me for interrupting.
Okay, well, thank you.
Excuse me, because you can make any point you want. I don't mind at all. But I would like to know when I mentioned large-scale farming. Large-scale farming. I spoke about a long-term trend of labor outflow from agriculture, which I will give you a slide. So please. But I spoke about trends on productivity, and I will mention again in my answers this. But if I said something about large-scale farming, please tell me where I said it.
So, for example, when you advocated a productivist logic, which basically said that when the larger the company, the bigger the growth of the European Union, that kind of implies that you're advocating that the centralization of capital underneath these organizations, transnational corporations, or those who are propagating land grabbing in Eastern Europe. That's that's your implication by advocating what you did in terms of a productivist logic. And so, I mean, I just wanted to add the added ingredient that small-scale farming, as was mentioned earlier, is not only more productive, but it's also much more ecologically sustainable and friendly. There are many studies, such as the IAAS TD 2009 report, Petty et al. 2003, Rossett 1999, Badgley 2007, all of which conclude that small-scale farming is much more sustainable and, for example, via agroecological production methods, which are typical of food sovereignty farms, by the way. Thank you.
Laissez donc une réponse à Monsieur Agnotis qui a été.
Well, I think that we'll need to have replies from Mr. Agnotis because he's really been addressed by the questions primarily, and the others, of course.
Let's have a few things clear. I mean, I came here clearly with a different idea than what you have, but at least we can have a debate about the difference in ideas and not about things that you have imagined, that I believe. We're having a policy that has 60 billion euros annually granted to farmers. It could be granted to the wrong farmers, it could be granted in the wrong way, but it is 60 billion euros. So 60 billion euros that go every year has something to do with a logical public intervention that responds to some needs. We have a policy whose basic logic of the proposal was jointness in the delivery of the public and the private goods. If jointness in the delivery of the public and the private goods is what you think is large-scale farmers want to do, if 30% of the payment via greening is what you think large-scale farmers need to do, then we have to see in the debate who has supported and who has gone against this proposal. If you think that introducing for a multiple time capping of the large-scale payments, redistributive payments that will favor small farmers, granting to small farmers almost full exception for controls and simplifying what you do, is something that supports large-scale farming, I'm sorry, but we're talking totally different languages. And I think we're talking totally different languages because there is a prejudice that everything that comes from the Commission and every proposal we make necessarily has something to do with large-scale farming. There is absolutely nothing in the proposal that supports large-scale farming, whether it is the manner by which we distribute support, whether it is the conditions we put on greening, most of which go against not large-scale farmers, even medium-sized farmers, because the small farmers would be out. There is very clear provisions, and I mentioned supporting young farmers, and it's the Commission that giving the battle that these provisions stay mandatory for all member states. Somebody developed these proposals. It is the same thing that happened with the simplification scheme for small farmers, with all the rural development measures that help local networks, help agro-environmental measures. So at least if we want to have some serious debate, it has to start with the basic facts. What I mentioned, and that's why I got upset, what I mentioned had absolutely nothing to do with land-scale farming, because land-scale farming is small, so small that you don't even look in the statistics. If you look at if you take as farmers the corporations you mentioned in Romania, they will not even count in the overall statistics. They will count in the huge amount of land that they occupy, but this is not the number of farmers that move out of agriculture. What I mean is this. We have...
Sorry.
You basically talk about hidden costs and killing the European citizens with chemical food. So
I don't have a problem to speak about hidden costs or open costs. We have a whole exercise in trying to be able to measure this. What I want to say is that if you look in the particular cases that you have mentioned, the fact of the matter is that the structure of certain member states accommodated more land-scale farming than others. The question is, do the measures proposed do something to mitigate this effect or not? And that is the issue. And if you look, for example, what happens right now with the proposal of the reform, in terms of the increase of the average payment that we propose to farming in Romania, and what happens with the small farmer scheme, which will help small farmers stay in Romania, I think probably you will come with a different answer than the one you can.
On ne peut pas faire un très long débat maintenant.
We haven't got time for a lengthy discussion, but I'm going to give Antonio the floor for a few minutes, and Andrea 2 minutes maybe. It's about all we've got.
La première leçon que nous avons appris.
The first thing that we've learned in negotiating the guidelines, there's the responsibility of the state, and there's also the responsibility of those who are involved in the negotiation, and they're not always on the same wavelength, and you can see that in the CAP reform negotiations as well. Something that's come up quite a few times in the context of the guidelines. When we talk about investment, what sort of investment is it, for example? But I think this is something where the negotiations have taken place, and in the FAO as well. But clearly we do have a challenge. This is my last point. I know we've got a number of specialists in economics here, and I've also studied statistics myself, but I think you have to accept that there is a challenge. You need to redefine the concept of productivity, and you've also got to have a proper ratio of production versus productive potential. So I think there's no reason why all holdings should be condemned from the outset to having to be more productive than they are. And the cost of production of small holdings in Europe, if you start taking into account all supplementary costs which fall on the small holdings. Just one example. I've got tomatoes and chickens. I organize it all myself. I don't have too far to travel to market this. But when we had someone coming to open up a major center in Rome, they couldn't just plow ahead because they had to get all sorts of authorizations and certificates for their water and this and that and the other. So these are all production costs which bear very heavily on small holdings from Norway down to Greece. These demands on small holdings bring a very large cost. So if these things are going to be counted in, I don't know whether they are going to be counted in, but they should be. And with the current crisis, now people are trying to do things on their own and just get on with it. But obviously, big scale, you have to pay it. 1 minute left for Andrea.
Open a debate on CAP now because it was very impossible just to say that if we spend 60 billion euro per year without any employment criteria, if the European citizen will be aware of that, somebody will start to ask why we spend 60 billion euro. And I need to remind that we waste 30% of our production, and this is a very important study that was done also by the Commission. So maybe it's not the problem of focusing on productivism, the problem today, as we have so much waste. But the problem here is another. We don't want to reopen the discussion on CAP now. CAP has an effect on the land, that is clear. And what we want from the Commission and from the Parliament is that we realize that we have a huge problem. Land grabbing is in Europe a huge problem. CAP is not the answer. We need to give different answer. And this is what we want. and we want to arrive to an answer in short time. And this is, we need to find out instrument, starting with a resolution in the Parliament, starting in the work in the Commission, and we want a directive in that sense.
Okay, it's up to me now to try to draw some conclusions from this debate, and I will move on in Portuguese. So, please.
Well, we don't have a lot of time available, so it's not an easy task to draw conclusions from this debate. Well, in any case, first of all, let me begin on behalf of the GUI NGL. I'd like to thank all the speakers in this debate this morning. I'd like to thank you individual participants, and I'd like to thank the organisations represented here. It's been a very wide-ranging, rich debate. And it will leave our political group here in the European Parliament, the GUI NGL, Nordic Green Left, better prepared to tackle these questions here in the European Parliament. And of course, I'd also like to welcome this study, this research done by Via Campesina. It's a piece of research which is going to make a major contribution to putting this problem we've been discussing on the agenda. It will help us illustrate that this problem of land grab is a serious one in our countries and in the developing countries, but it's also a problem in Europe. And the problem of land grab is one that this report helps demonstrate is one which can spread to all European countries. The report is logical. It illustrates what has happened in recent decades. This land grabbing phenomenon also is inseparable from our agricultural policies and other sectoral policies, in particular trade policy. So land grab is indissociably linked to these policies in Europe and elsewhere. And the report shows what has been happening over recent decades. And these policies and the phenomenon of land grabbing has led to a shifting of production from the land, a shifting of people from the land. They've led to an intensification of agricultural production in some areas and an abandoning of agricultural production in other regions. And increasingly, what has been happening, part of the same phenomenon, is production, agricultural production, further and further away from the consumer, the final consumer, which means more energy spent on transport as well as production and so on and so forth, which is all bad for the environment. So you've had this relocation and concentration of production away from the point of consumption. And all this has been part of a process building up thanks to the CAP, thanks to trade policy, and thanks also to the land grabbing phenomenon. So this land grabbing and this large-scale agricultural production has led to a dismantling of traditional markets. It's led us to a mass agricultural production market, leaving aside and forgetting the other purposes of agricultural production, creation of jobs, serving local communities with food, and producing food with the underlying principle of food sovereignty. That has been abandoned, and that is what we want to get back. And now a number of European countries are dependent on the outside world for their food, which does not do anything, of course, for their food security and food sovereignty. So when we talk about land grabbing, we have to be aware of the overall process it's part of, which has been going on for decades. Trade itself and trade policy has exaggerated this whole phenomenon, especially relocation and concentration of production in given regions and abandoning of the land in other areas. It's all been the logical result of the successive agricultural reforms we've had. There's been an increasing concentration on the market, on the rationalisation of the market, and the concentration and rationalisation of production, notably mass production of food. And I can only see, unless we do something, these problems intensifying in coming years. Now, in our political group here in the European Parliament, the GUE's NGL, we've already made hundreds of proposals for amendments to the various CAP regulations, seeking to achieve what I've just been outlining. What we believe in is a profound change in the current CAP. That's why we've tabled all these amendments over the years to the agricultural regulations. We now need agricultural production in Europe, which allows us to achieve food sovereignty and food security in the European Union. At the same time, and this is part of the same policy, we need to support small farmers in Europe in the future. And at the same time, by an appropriate regulation of the market, we want to achieve fair prices for producers, fair prices for consumers. Farmers have been saying for years, actually, we don't want subsidies, we don't want support, we just want a fair price for what we produce. This is what they've been saying. And the CAP has been neglecting that demand from the overwhelming majority of small farmers in Europe for decades now. And I think things have to change now to the direction small farmers have been asking for. What we've had, however, is deregulation and market-oriented policies leading to mass market. Part of this phenomenon is the greening of Europe. This particular policy is not going to change anything in the context of the present CAP. The CAP has already lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people of Europe. And the so-called greening policy is an attempt to lend legitimacy to a policy which has been disowned by the majority of people in Europe, the CAP. The greening policy won't change anything. The big landowners will still get most of the subsidies on offer from the CAP, which just lead to more concentration of production on enormous holdings. It will lead to a further distortion of the way CAP funds are distributed between the member states of the European Union. More funds will go to those countries with the greatest concentration of production, with the largest areas of land in the hands of the smallest number of owners. Whatever the CAP says, whatever the politicians are saying about the CAP, it's not going to be more green in the future. The way the reforms are being proposed, it will still lead to concentration of production, expansion of the size of holdings, and the concentration of holdings in the hands of very few landowners in Europe, as we're seeing in southern Spain at the moment. Now, I can't respond to all the points made from the floor this morning, but I thank you all for your contributions. They certainly enriched this debate. So let me just conclude by saying this. We in the GUE NGL group in the European Parliament, you can count on us to lend you our support as we struggle together to bring about profound change in the CAP in Europe. We need far bigger changes and far greater changes backing up reform, an appropriate reform of the CAP across all European Union policies. What we are seeking to do is to achieve these things, and our political group in this Parliament are determined to support you in your campaigns and in your struggles as you struggle to achieve the right kind of CAP. It's a campaign and a fight we will support you in. And we will play our part in the European institutions to put forward your arguments as we all fight together for the appropriate reforms of the CAP, which are so necessary for all of us, for our futures.
Merci. Et